Well, I remember when I was first asked what a curator was, you know, I didn't realize the profundity of the misunderstanding or lack of information about it. And I think the first time that somebody said, oh, you must do basket weaving, then I realized that there was a serious problem here. I guess what I do is, if I'm being flip, I just say we cure art, because, I mean, it just plays on the words.
I sometimes think people imagine that we are sort of like St. Jerome in his cell, examining literature and writing away. But, and in fact, we find ourselves very much in constant contact with people, perhaps more so than the art itself.
Primarily, of course, we're all custodians. It's our job to preserve material and hand it on to future generations for study and appreciation. But beyond that, there's an important function of interpreting the collection. And in that sense, I suppose curators are a kind of teacher.
We go out and look at objects for research purposes in European museums. We go out into the field to visit and work on excavations to which this museum contributes funds. It's just a marvelous variety of things.
Now, the British use the term keeper, but in this country, keeper is more closely connected with the zoo. And I don't want to compare the other great New York institutions with ours, but I don't think the comparison would be fair.
On January 27, 1982, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, an exhibition opened comprised of works of art, each of which was purchased for less than $5,000 by 16 of the museum's curators. This program is about 5 of these men and women, seldom seen or heard, but constantly on display.
The exhibition that's going on now provides this department a very rich opportunity to show off our collection, because after all, the majority of objects that come in here are not of enormous monetary value. That is to say, paintings cost millions of dollars and musical instruments don't. This exhibition allows us to take a number of recent purchases, which we think are quite interesting and fun, and show them off to the public long before we could have done that in the normal rotation of our exhibition.
You can buy wonderful antiquities for $150 or for $200. You don't even have to use the 5,000 limit graciously imposed on us by the museum for the current exhibition. But I walked through that show and I have no precise recollection of how much I paid. And nor do I think should it be emphasized, because we are not dealing with a bargain counter or Filene's basement in this show. We are, in fact, trying to do the paradoxical opposite. We are trying to show the public, here are objects of varying sizes, different departments, some more beautiful than others, but all rather interesting. And who would have thought that there was such a strict economic limit of the price tag?
It's true in general that it's hard to think of money in relation to these objects, because when the object is unique or there are only a few other examples of it, what is the price of that object? It just depends who wants it, how much they want it. So it's all a very relative thing. But I think the exhibit is interesting that way, in that it gives you a little inkling of what's possible.
because prints are multiples and not unique works of art, they tend to have price tags that are lower than unique works, drawings or paintings or sculpture, something of that sort. So, but you really get quite a bit for your money with prints because they aren't multiples. We certainly could have filled that gallery all by ourselves with things that we had bought. I probably have two favorites among the items that are exhibited in that show. The first would be a 16th century French etching, and the other is a 20th century color lithograph, is Jasper John's lithograph. The etching is by an artist who is connected with the decoration of Fontainebleau, Francis I's hunting lodge outside of Paris. This particular etcher, Jean Mignon, was a kind of propagandist for the extravagant style of art that was produced in this redecoration project.
We've displayed one lovely piece of American folk art, a violin case that was made in Georgia, probably in the late 19th century. It's carved entirely of walnut, but from a distance of 3 feet, you wouldn't notice that. I didn't when I was first shown it by a dealer. I wondered why I was being shown this ratty old violin case. And the dealer said, "Fool, you're a curator, look at it again." And I did, and I discovered that all the buckles and locks and the leather that I thought was leather, the stitches, the wear, everything was carved of solid wood, and it was a play against the eye, trompe-l'œil. And I was fascinated that someone would have gone to so much trouble to whittle out a box to deceive someone. It's really a game, and I can imagine that case and the violin in it being carried from one to another of the fiddling conventions throughout the South, and being shown off to the amazement of the people who were gathered there, and to their great amusement as well.
The kinds of things that we have really emphasize the difference, the crucial difference that you have in the 20th century visually from everything else, and the pieces do stand out. This collage is by Howardina Pindell. The artist is a very good friend of mine. These are kind of interesting because they were produced at a period after which she was in a very bad auto accident and had a severe blow to her head, to the point where she suffered from periodic bouts of amnesia. So this is all part of what she calls the Oval Memory Series. And what she did was she began to cut up old postcards. She saved postcards that people had done, and she sort of reassembled them, you know, into a design. And it was a way for her to get in touch with her past.
One question about the object that's in the exhibit is what it was used for, and that's not something that we really have an answer for. It dates from 19th, 18th century BC, the Old Babylonian period in southern Mesopotamia, which is not really very well represented in terms of works of art. There are some monumental objects and almost nothing at a sort of minor art level. The best guess for how they're used is that they have something to do with the manufacture of textiles, with weaving, that they would have held some of the threads that have to move on these rollers, and that it wouldn't have been for just weaving any old everyday object, but probably for a very particular type of narrow band that decorated the statues and figures of the gods and goddesses. Who were the little kneeling men with a forelock? To answer that sort of question, we go really to cylinder seals, where more of these figures, that's this type of object. The value of these small objects is that they represent all types of people, priests, gods, animals, trees, plants, everything, so that they give us the sort of whole background picture of who these people were.
I make no division in price tags between an object that is a little more or a little less. Besides, figures are terribly deceptive. Here is an object for which I paid a ludicrously small amount at an auction in Cologne. I saw a marble alabastron falsely labeled Egyptian in the catalog. I happened to see the beautifully painted band of a meander in the zone of the lugs that are on either side of it. I recognized it was Greek, and I started bidding, and I got it for under $200. The fact that I got one for very little does not mean that the next one that I find will be equally inexpensive. And one forgets how much one pays. I at least do. Do you remember how much you paid for a given meal 25 years ago? No, all you remember is that it was a lot cheaper 25 years ago.
The blues and greens with little tinges of red really sort of work very well.
Yes, you've got the same color range.
It's a very fine line when you're buying a piece about how much of it is really your taste and how much of it is really you're keeping in mind what the museum needs and sort of trying to predict or project what will be significant in history. Now, the sum total of a collection such as the 20th Century Art collection in this museum, really any curatorial collection reflects the generations of curators who've come, because the museum's 112 years old. That makes it exciting.
My predecessor was here for over 30 years, and his focus was principally on the depiction of musical instruments in art. What do instruments show about the painting? What do they mean? What do they symbolize? I have a lot of respect for that approach insofar as it gives you evidence about social history, about music history, about how instruments were used. But my background as a performer led me to want to hear these instruments and to get my hands on them, literally. And so my bias, if you will, is that the instruments are here also to serve as tools for musicians, which is something of a novelty in this museum, to actually use the objects in a collection for the purpose for which they were made. And one doesn't fight duels with the swords in the arms and armor department, nor eat off the silver in decorative arts. But here, because I'm interested in hearing these instruments and I love to play them, I invite people to come in and we give concerts and we make recordings and we try to use the collection as much as possible, because I think it's only through hearing the instruments and playing them that one can really appreciate what they're all about. They're not just objects to look at. We try to encourage builders to make accurate copies, because it's only by making copies that musicians have the opportunity to handle and play and learn the techniques of these instruments. They obviously can't all come here to play on our material because it's too fragile. And therefore people write to us and ask for information, and of course we can't take these instruments apart and cut them up to provide information, but through x-rays and other kinds of measuring techniques we can give at least something approximating the data that a builder needs.
This is part of the original.
And the base is separate from the feet.
So it's really a matter of reconstructing what's here and seeing if we've got enough left so that somebody would be able to recognize it.
There we go.
I think one of the things that's a little different about this department than other departments is that the whole basis for our existence, in a sense, is the archaeological field work. In other words, we're not dealing with objects that are all of them above ground. A lot of the major material is being excavated all the time. The books are here to give us photographs and people's opinions about things, but there's nothing that can equal the experience of actually working in the field. That they just used every little bit.
The more you study anything in detail, the closer you get to the artistic effort. And the closer you get to the artistic effort, the better you understand the artist. And if you want to be even more philosophical, you would say that of all the people that have lived, the ones that are most interesting to know are the artists. I would rather, in the hereafter, have an interesting talk with 3 or 4 selected vase painters than, let us say, with 3 or 4 politicians of the period of Cleon, end of the 5th century.
And the purpose of this exhibition, which is called Counterparts, was to try to probe beneath the surface of what causes a picture to become meaningful. And I thought that people would begin to focus...
There are 6 curators who work in this department. We've all been educated in art history and literature and languages to a greater or lesser degree. I think we all share not only a love of prints and photographs, but we also have an insatiable curiosity about the people who made these pictures and the people who look at them. I think in this department it's been quite a tradition of thinking of prints in terms of their own times, not as isolated works of art, because prints are such a democratic form of art. It's really impossible to isolate them from the time or the circumstances under which they were produced.
I never wanted to become a fireman, I assure you. I never wanted to become a detective. Although, I mean, my later work has led me to some detective work. in April of last year, on a Saturday afternoon, I visited a very small art gallery in Paris, where on a previous visit I had seen nothing of interest to me. But in the meantime, the owner of the gallery had gone all the way to Geneva to hear me lecture, and I thought that was very courteous on his part. And so when he said, please come back when next you are in Paris because I found something more that might interest you, I took him up on it. I arrived and I saw a little box, and you spoke of dust a little while ago, and I will say it was a box filled with rather dusty objects. And in that box, among some pieces of no interest whatsoever, I saw 3 fragments of Attic red-figured pottery. And I will now show you, although I have to hide one piece because that was not there, I will now show you the 3 fragments, 1, 2 joined here, and the 3rd in my right hand. So you look at them and you discover they have glossy glaze on the inside. Hence, they can only be from a calyx crater or a bell crater. Then you discover from the style of drawing that you are dealing with the period between 515 and 500 BC. And all of this is done in your subconscious mind. You don't even articulate and formulate these great discoveries. But then, all of a sudden, you remember the curious pattern worn by the archer here, and you say to yourself, wait a bit, where have I seen that before? And you remember a fragment in Oxford, and you remember that the fragment in Oxford has been there since 1928, and that it joins in turn something that is totally lost. And you come to the almost instant recognition that what you have in front of you on a Saturday afternoon in Paris is bound to join a fragment perhaps not more than 2.5 inches across in Oxford. The recognition that a fragment belongs occurs in a split second. I have never been able to time it. It's only after that wonderful feeling of having stumbled across something totally unknown up to now that you have to spend a little bit of time verifying it. And the verification comes almost like an anticlimax. The long and short of it is that we made an exchange on long-term loan between Oxford and the Metropolitan Museum. And this fragment, of which you see a sketch on my mount, is now joined and united to what I bought in Paris.
We recently acquired a group of Tibetan instruments from several different sources, these by purchase. And we didn't have room to show all of the Tibetan instruments that we got. I did bring another more spectacular one along. It's a Tibetan trumpet, or horn, and these telescope out to enormous length. This one I'm handling with my bare hands and perhaps should be wearing gloves, but we will clean it carefully. And as you can see, it's practically 6 feet long. It's made of white brass and ordinary brass-colored brass. These rings, fabric rings, are here to hold the sections apart when the whole thing collapses. And these are ordinarily played in pairs. The opposite end is held by someone up in the air, and the monk at this end blows into this with a technique which involves circular breathing. That is to say, at the same time as he's blowing with his lips and forcing air through, he's inhaling through his nose. So he can get a continuous sound that seems to go on forever and ever. I don't know how to do that. Some contemporary oboists have mastered that technique. Anyway, it gives a very deep sound, as one might imagine from the length, and a very imposing sound if you imagine the echoes ricocheting off the mountains in the Himalayas, a spooky sound. And with the sound of the drum and the sound of these trumpets and the bells, which are frequently used in Tibetan rituals, It's not music as we perceive it. It's noise to awaken the gods, to arouse the spirits, and to bring their attention down to man. I'm not very good at making an imposing noise on Tibetan trumpets, but I will give it a try, and perhaps for a fraction of a second you can imagine what it would be like outdoors among the mountains.
As my wife would say, it must be very old and very valuable. But there are objects that are old and not necessarily terribly valuable. Time and again, I am being offered, for instance, a Roman lamp found in the Holy Land or elsewhere in the Mediterranean. And I explain that it is roughly 2,000 years old. And then I am asked, well, would you like to buy it? And I decline. Now, why do I decline? Because Roman lamps were very, very common. The sculptured surface is quite often stamped from a mold, and they have, unless they represent a very rare type, neither an iconographic nor a great artistic interest. But the unfortunate and unhappy owner of such a lamp does not quite accept my low valuation until I explain that if 2,000 years from now flashlight batteries turn up in a dig, then you would have the perfect comparison in terms of value between a Roman lamp of a given period, regardless of its provenance, and its wide application. I am really bigamous because I am wedded also to the objects. And if you are wedded to objects, I cannot leave this place. And I have resisted all temptations to quit. Therefore, you have, as opposed to the purely academic, you have that marvelous daily contact with objects. I look a bit at it like Antaios, who regained his strength by contact with Mother Earth. And you know, Heracles killed Antaios by lifting him bodily off the earth. But so long as he was in touch with Earth, Heracles could not really conquer Antaios. And that quality only a museum will give you. That's why I cannot operate in a room that has only an electronic device and a computer. No, I would have to have what you see here. I would have to have three-dimensional objects.
I could not say what satisfies me most about this job. I think partly it's a sense of continuity, of being responsible for objects which have been here far longer than I have and which will exist far after I'm gone. I have a sense of honor and a sense of awe in having the opportunity to study and handle them so intimately.
I am of the generation that had to do most of its museum education without audio-visual and other mechanical aids. We went to a museum, paid our admission, bought perhaps a brief guide so as not to lose our way in the galleries, and then we looked. And looking is what I encourage everyone, whether they be scholars or students or general public.
It's the contact with people on a day-to-day basis that I find most fulfilling. People come with questions, they come with objects to identify, they come for advice of various sorts. We try very hard to use the objects here as a nucleus for expanding knowledge outside the walls of the museum. I'm learning, we're all learning from the art, and we're able every day to put out our knowledge and to learn more things by responding to questions. I find that terribly exciting and very gratifying.